Hello and welcome to this edition of EdTech Mondays Africa. So many innovations have come out of hubs on the African continent, like this one here at Noshken in Kigali, Rwanda. And education technology has now taken the shape that one cannot talk about education without talking about the technology aspect of it. But the question still remains, what is it going to take? Who are the key players who need to drive this strengthening and building resilience of our African EdTech ecosystems? My name is Joy Doreen Bira. Welcome to our August edition of EdTech Mondays, where we are speaking to our EdTech Mondays country partners from 6 African countries. Allow me to introduce to us our panelists on the show. We've got Origen Igiraneza, who is the chairperson EdTech Forum here in Rwanda, and he's also the Chief Executive Officer of Genius Panda. We also have Jennifer Cotter Otieno, who is the co-founder and Chief Executive Officer at EdTech East Africa, based out of Kenya. We also have Arthur Mukembo, who is the lead at the Future Lab Studio at the Innovation Village in Uganda. And we do have Chinenlu Akpa, who is the practice lead for education at the Co-Creation Hub, or CC Hub, in Nigeria. We also have Olufemi Adeomi, also known as Femi, who is the programs director at MEST Africa in Ghana. We have with us Radiat Meshasha Kasa, who is the supervisor and host of EdTech Mondays Ethiopia. It's so good to have her with us as well. And we are going to be taking contributions from our audience, who also happen to be stakeholders in the EdTech ecosystem. And we are honored to have them as well in our audience. And so how exactly do we build an EdTech ecosystem across the African continent, one that works for us? Of course, we have started the journey, but more needs to be done, and that is why we're having this conversation. So if I just might start by posing the question to Chinenlu, who is from Nigeria. Chinenlu, I want to hear from you. A lot of work has been put in, not just by CC Hub, but all of us here. But then, are we content? What exactly is the current state? How do we assess the EdTech ecosystem in Africa today?
EdTech in Africa has come a long way. Before now, EdTech was seen as something that was very vague. There's a lot of secrecy and mystery around EdTech. People felt they needed big devices, big tools to make EdTech happen. We believed we couldn't learn away from the classroom. So when you think about EdTech, you're thinking about something very germane, maybe more particular to the Western world. But then COVID happened. Before now, there wasn't any research going on in EdTech. We weren't even attracting funding. But next to fintech, EdTech is attracting a lot of funding to the African continent. So all of these things are happening, and people are saying that EdTech is the next big thing. So people are now collaborating. People are saying, how can we come together to synergize, put together our expertise, put together our efforts to make EdTech better? So how do we build better products? How do we ensure that schools and other EdTech stakeholders are able to uptake all the amazing things that we're building? So people are no longer working individually. I can reach out to a colleague in Uganda, and I am learning. There's this immersive learning going on in EdTech.
The same is true for Ethiopia. So my sister from Nigeria already stated that's the infrastructure issue. We have that too. And then in Ethiopia, we are only having this EdTech technologies, these solutions only in the universities. It's been just 2 years since license is granted for the higher education so that they can give their classes online. That's also that shows how we are back. So we're still working, we're struggling, we're trying to catch up, but we still have a lot to do because we're not concentrating on the elementary part of the schooling thing because we are only on the higher part of it, which brings the digital gap between the generation, right? So students from rural area, they are still struggling to cope up with students from urban areas. So universities are using the EdTech solutions, and then students who are coming from rural area, they're struggling to cope up with the urban one. So the digital gap is still there, and we have a long way to go.
We have so much better evidence now than we've ever had before. Previously, all of the evidence around EdTech was coming from other places. And over the last few years, in terms of the local research that's being done about what works for our students, our teachers, our parents here on the continent, and really research that's being done by local African researchers or institutions focused on what works in context. So for learners in rural areas versus learners in urban areas, using different types of technologies, making sure they're culturally relevant, all of the things that we know add up to really great learning. Now, all of a sudden, we have more evidence than we've ever had before to help inform us having a conversation about how do we all move forward together.
I think that's a very interesting point, because it is a similar case to Rwanda, where when we started EdTech Mondays, we were just as EdTech entrepreneurs who were discussing about what's going on in the ecosystem. Then when COVID hit, EdTech became another interesting topic for many organizations, stakeholders. But then what happened, just to build on what you said, last year when ICT Chamber and the MasterCard Foundation came together to do a very comprehensive research about the EdTech landscaping in the country. It was amazing to see the facts that came out of there. And then what happened afterwards was bringing together all these actors to now discuss who is doing what and when, how can we get all people together to move the EdTech into the the best future that we want it to be.
Yeah, maybe I'll take an alternate view. While a lot is happening, compared to other areas where we're having technology disruption, EdTech is still where we were behind. If you compare with FinTech, for example, there's still a whole lot of opportunity for EdTech. And if you imagine that the market is huge, probably bigger than FinTech, the FinTech market, then it's I don't know what to say. It's surprising that people are not just jumping in to take advantage of this huge opportunity. I think maybe this is the awareness problem we're talking about, for us to create awareness for people to see what is really, really the potential in this space.
I think what I also find interesting is COVID also came as a catalytic event, but found that already certain steps were being taken to enable interesting use cases like EdTech to flourish, right? In Uganda alone, for example, we've got over 4,400 kilometers of fiber optic cable that's already been laid across the country. And now the goal is, how do you extend that to literally the village level to enable last mile access, at least at the infrastructure level. But if you're extending infrastructure and there are no use cases on top of that, then you'll not get a return on that investment. And so what we've seen EdTech doing is, it's a great use case that's going to be used on a daily basis, can be used on demand, so on and so forth. So how do you now begin to build interesting models on top of that? Which is why we like the fact that now we have our own evidence in the local market context, evidence we can compare across regions on the continent. We're seeing language issues coming up, so on and so forth. And so I think it finds us at a point where right now it's a case of finding sustainable models, but the case for EdTech has been demonstrated and it's manifested in multiple different ways. So it's an exciting time to be in the space.
We've heard our panelists talking about use cases, sustainability. Femi mentioned something about lingering opportunities that we need to tap into. But do we get a sense of direction when we're talking about EdTech solutions for Africa?
I think we're still trying to figure out how to do it. There's a lot of opportunity, but the sort of thing that we're doing with EdTech Mondays is just one of those ways where we're trying to figure out that direction. There's a lot more that needs to be done, a lot more conversation with policymakers, with parents, with stakeholders that need to happen to actually chart a clear path to bringing EdTech up to where it should be.
I want to borrow a leaf from your book to say that whilst we want to grow, it would be in a bad place if we want to come at EdTech with a one-size-fits-all approach, right? There has to be individuality. Whilst you're still working together, you still need to understand. So that's where the place of research comes in. There has to be heavy research done but still working with other people to know what is happening around you, then building for your market, building for your country. So if you're thinking you're going to sit down in Rwanda or you're going to sit down in Uganda and build something or come up with models or policies that would reflect across Africa, you're digging a pit that is going to, swallow everybody in. So it has to be very individual, very intentional, clearly thought out, a lot of research. And thank you for the power of data right now. You need to keep testing and find models that fit. And even within countries, you'll find out that even in one country, you have various models that will fit various categories of learners and use cases and the rest. So that's how I want to say it.
Yeah. And really kind of picking on top of that is you're already seeing multiple efforts to try and figure it out. Anytime a sector is becoming mainstream, is that you tend to find people trying to figure out how would it work in my context and then how do I play into the others. So already education ministries across Africa and really in many places in the world were shocked at how unprepared a lot of them were when the pandemic hit, and now we suddenly have to decide, do the kids not study at all? Do we quickly adopt this? So in the Ugandan context, there were efforts around using radio, for example, using TV. And then if you're using TV, who teaches? Do I have 5 different people doing the mathematics training or whatever not? Then you had X number of startups coming up with learning management systems and the same kinds of business models and whatever not, right? So a lot of things were tried out, and, that pandemic bubble helped us to do rapid prototyping and whatnot. Where we find ourselves in an interesting conundrum is which ones of those can be proven to be staying or sustainable per se, right? And that's where policy innovation becomes critical. But policy innovation cannot exist outside of market systems, because then you'll end up having interventions that require the hand of public money for them to be sustainable, which in that case is not going to ever reach the critical mass, the critical level of adoption that we needed to reach. So I think as we think through the EdTech opportunity, is that how do we think through market-driven initiatives that are able to catalyze effective demand for these things, tackle issues around access, gentrification as you continue to be able to drive adoption so that no learner is left behind, but most importantly, that do not disrupt the learning experience of the young person. I think for us that remains very, very critical in what we're doing around EdTech.
So we have to also give the ball to the government, because like in Africa, governments are like more powerful institutions, right? So while like doing the policies and strategies, they have to also enable startups so that they can scale up, right? So we have these startup companies, students are doing EdTech solutions and everything, like they are not being accepted by the government offices, the teachers, and so on. So the government has a very big role to play because it's one of a powerful institution in Africa. So we should also give the ball for the government, and then entrepreneurs can like pick up from there and then do their things.
And I think that collaboration, oftentimes we think it's just saying the word, let's collaborate, right? It's an easy thing. But the reality is the practicalities of collaboration are actually very complex. And understanding the diverse stakeholders that operate within an EdTech ecosystem. So you're talking about everything from power providers, grid or off-grid. You're talking about connectivity and hardware. You're talking about policymakers, implementers on the ground, NGOs, community-based organizations, the entrepreneurs, media, all of our diverse stakeholders, and everyone operates on different paces, in different ways. And so understanding and creating transparency and clarity around how those different stakeholders actually operate, the cycles of their work, and giving our ecosystem members, the empathy to understand how to be agile and to work together more effectively, I think is part of what we as ecosystem builders aim to do, to allow that collaboration to happen more seamlessly, so we can all move faster together.
I think we were, at least in Rwanda, we've seen that happening and working. I remember when this EdTech Monday started, some of entrepreneurs were complaining about the issues they were facing, which were limiting them to get to the final, to the end users. But what happened as one of the opportunities after these conversations, when we were bringing people together, these people are getting support. We have testimonies of contracts being signed. We've seen recommendation letters being written to some of the entrepreneurs to go to the schools to try out their solution. So there is that already movement happening. But then what again we've done in the previous year was to identify these needs, these various needs that are faced by different stakeholders. And then from there, we wrote recommendations. These recommendations were like policy recommendations. We wrote recommendation about the product and services. We wrote a recommendation about the EdTech company support, which might be needed. And it even went beyond to procurement. How could people procure for the EdTech solutions? And this is where now comes the next conversation. Whenever we are coming together, we'll be like, now let's design a roadmap of how do we address these issues. And then there we can put an accountability mechanism and say like, we said like by this time we'll be doing this, and that's where we're at.
I like the direction this conversation is taking. And before we even come to that one phrase that need not miss in strengthening an African EdTech ecosystem, let me throw this conversation to the audience, hear from them. What do they have to say?
I really wanted to add in on the actual opportunity that exists in EdTech. I think the important perspective we need to have is African families have a limited amount of expenses that they can really afford to put in. And usually the challenge in launching and running a technology solution is you're fighting with a limited amount of expense from food, rent. But that's not really the case usually for education, because African families really care about education. And education expenses are really high, and one of the top 3 expenses after food and rent. So that gives us a very much bigger opportunity than other tech solutions, because already families are quite really invested in. And I think it's very important for regulators, tech entrepreneurs to really understand this a much bigger market and really approach it from that perspective. And I think the market is really already open and investing in your kid education is already something that families are already convinced. So I think we really need to get that perspective, and I think that's we don't really always realize how critical is that, and the market is quite much more open comparing to other tech solution. Look at entertainment, could be even fintech. Usually they can be an option. So once that's limited, it's usually very challenging for families to actually really put that extra amount of money to. But that's not the case for education, and that's very important to be recognized across the stakeholders.
There's also another aspect which I know all our partners on the stage today have considered. We've kind of followed them with this. But I think the industry generally starts from a very technical point of view of EdTech. What will be a really swanky app? How will it be like looking on the screens, etc.? A lot of times we ignore one major key player that helps in adoption of EdTech, and those are the teachers and the teaching fraternity. Too often we don't take into account how easy is it for you to understand this and kind of either deploy in the classroom, or how do you see this students, learners, or even parents using this to advance learning? So that, I think, is a very critical component that we should never forget. The teaching fraternity, before you write a single line of code, run the idea by teachers. Otherwise, it's never going to be adopted.
Antone from Ethiopia has talked about the cost of education, but he's also mentioned that African parents actually are intentional about education for their children, but there seems to be a missing link. Let's speak to the missing factor.
I mean, and indeed, it starts from first principles. EdTech is not a magic bullet. It's part of a mix of pedagogical tools and different other things that you're doing to equip the learner at the end of the journey. And a lot of that agency is entrusted in the teacher, who also has certain constraints. Oftentimes, public sector teachers are paid late, underpaid, paid in installments, so many other issues that they face. So there's already a motivation barrier with the many, many things that this teacher has to overcome before they even leverage EdTech to be able to pass on learning to the student. Then you have the actual learners themselves who are in environments that sometimes are not conducive, so on and so forth. There's a lot to fix. But if you take a market-driven approach, it's that find the inefficiencies that already exist and figure out what's the one pain point I as an entrepreneur, I as a solution provider can speak to, and how do I elucidate other actors along this value chain as to where the rest of the opportunities are, or where I see other constraints or challenges or whatever. Note that together, it's a concerted effort. I think the more we begin to communicate learnings and what we're finding along the way, the more you build market transparency that then encourages these kinds of innovations to come to market. So EdTech Monday, for example, as a platform does that. It's that convene people who are picking different slices of this challenge and have them articulate what's working, what isn't, what they wish could be in place for them to do what they do better. And the more we have these kinds of conversations, the more other actors then pick interest. And we give them the platform. Before you know it, you've built a very vibrant ecosystem that's passionate about making sure that this is solved. Maybe we start there.
For us to keep in mind, I think EdTech Mondays does a really good job of focusing on how do we make learning inclusive for everyone. So how are we thinking about technology that enables learning for refugees, for learners with disabilities, for girls who are often left behind? And so thinking about inclusion as a kind of first principle, right? How are we empowering our entrepreneurs to understand universal design for learning? How are we encouraging the funders in our community to, allow our entrepreneurs space and resources to ensure that they are able to design products that are central and designed for those different types of contexts, different learners. And so making sure that we have the space, the ability to test and design things that actually make sense, so that we're not just designing for one type of learner, but all of the learners in our ecosystem.
What does testing really look like in this context, really?
I think it means literally going to the ground, talking with teachers, talking with learners, talking with parents, and listening properly, taking the feedback, being agile, and adapting. I think, entrepreneurs, this is one of their superpowers, to be honest. They're really great at taking in information, taking evidence, and transforming the way that they work quickly, and trying out something new, and not holding a lot of ego in the design of their products and tools. Governments tend to have a different type of scaling process because a lot of factors contribute to this, but they have so many more learners they're serving. So, you might do a small pilot, but then immediately you're required to scale to millions of learners across the country. And there's less of that kind of agile development. And so this is where collaboration between different members of the ecosystem can be so powerful, because it allows us to take learnings from that agile process, contribute that into a more, at scale learning system, so that every learner becomes more served better by the innovations we're actually creating.
So I was going to talk about bureaucracy. Education is heavily guarded by the government across Africa. So whilst we think, there's so many exciting things we can do, and I spoke about in the beginning how, yes, education in EdTech in Africa is growing, we cannot take the conversation away from the foot of the government. And this is government across Africa. And I particularly applaud the Mastercard Foundation, because they held the Ministerial Forum 2 times now. And what they did was they brought in, education stakeholders, ministers of education. They spoke about, education. So we need to get the government to speak about education and get them to have that buy-in. When they get the buy-in, it solves another problem: funding. Because EdTech is expensive. It's really expensive to build for EdTech. So people would not ordinarily want to go into EdTech, because from the time you're building to the time you make profits, it's a journey. So by the time you see that the government has bought into this, the government is willing to fund, the government is opening up and taking away some, bureaucratic bottlenecks that you ordinarily have. You can't really just go to schools and the rest. People who genuinely want to bring in money to fund people who have these ideas now have the confidence. So investors' confidence is established. Then the support comes in funding, in collaborations, and we see better products. We see better EdTech ecosystems growing across Africa.
It's true, EdTech is very expensive, but it's never a luxury, right? So we're not, when we say schools, we're not thinking about walls and blackboards anymore. So we can deliver content to students, especially who are in a rural area, through some EdTech solutions, right? So I think some of you are familiar with the hole-in-the-wall thing. So I think that happened in India, right? So there were these learners, rural learners, and then this person put a screen on the wall, and then they were coming there and then grabbing contents and everything. They were given an exam, and then they were able to score with the formal students, right? Right, like they were scoring. So it is expensive, but it's not luxury. So we have to start now. We're lagging, but we have to really start now.
I think what I wanted to add on is just creating a conducive environment for EdTech to grow. And this means from the policy standpoint, how do we create informed policies that allow EdTech companies and EdTech solutions to plug in. And then we go to the part of the demand and supply being matched. How do we make this happen and then unlock the market to the EdTech product? After that, what we will again need to do is to make sure that all the people who are involved into the ecosystem are playing their particular role in making it happen. That will remove the barrier of repeating efforts or making similar things everywhere. And then gradually we'll reach to underserved communities, we'll reach to these people with special needs, and that's how we'll be able to create a vibrant ecosystem.
If I may add, we also have to work on skills. So Mr. Suraj from the audience, he was telling us about the teachers, right? So some teachers in Africa are being reluctant because they have a lack of skills, right? So most of us are not familiar with the devices and everything. So we have to also work on the skills. Skills on the teachers, skills on the parents and students. So that's also another homework.
If I may jump on what was just said about underserved. What drove the innovation in the fintech space was a lot of conversation around financial inclusion. So maybe we need to bring the similar conversations into education about educational inclusion. And when that discussion was going on, startups started trying to solve problems with financial inclusion. And so similarly, I think we can do the same thing with education. And once that becomes mainstream, the startups can then be supported to scale. Now, once you have 2-3 startups that really grow big, everybody will jump in. So I think this is what we might want to look at.
All right. I love that there's a conversation that's ongoing about the costs, the funding. Chinyelu talked about how hard it is to fund EdTech itself, and also just talking about the digital skills themselves. It's just a whole other expense. But even in the expense, at least we know that there are success stories where investments have been made and results have been gotten. And I think I want, at this moment, to bring in Suraj again, just to talk about some of the programs that the Mastercard Foundation has been able to fund in terms of fostering and building a resilient EdTech ecosystem that currently helps us as well at the moment.
One of the things we're aiming to do is improve the gaps in education as perceived by governments and by other education stakeholders. For EdTech to thrive, it has to be demand-driven. And as somebody has said, predominantly in Africa, the schooling space, the learning space is from public schools, which is a government domain. So the government needs to buy into the idea of EdTech as an improvement for learning outcomes. So we kind of bring together the various stakeholders, as Chinyelu's mentioned. We've kind of done convenings, but we actually connect people together, and we're seeing there's actually demand from governments to say this is not something we'll do alone. We do need private sector, we do need development agents, we do need all the stakeholders sitting together to see who's going to do what part. That said, it's also our belief that the solutions to the problems and gaps we see in education right now need to be built locally. And so very much in favor of building an African EdTech ecosystem. And we're doing this in various ways. One of it is a fellowship program. Through tech hubs in countries, we capacity build innovative EdTech solutions through a little bit of a stipend, business development, thinking through the science of learning on their products, and then connect them to the government to show what can be achieved. But besides that, we also work with governments, with regulators to make a more enabling environment for those EdTech to thrive. But then you take a step out as well and look at all of that's happening. We also need to address policy. And this is where we've started to work with partners like World Bank. We've got the call for action from at least 12 ministries of education across Africa from last year, saying we've learned some valuable lessons during COVID. How do we turn our education system into more resilient hybrid models of learning so that we not only overcome shocks like the pandemic, but we also are now going to try and get education to the hands of those who couldn't even make it to maybe a bricks and mortar classroom previously. So we're working with the World Bank on thinking, helping them think through, support them in developing policies that will enable more hybrid models of learning, education become more resilient.
The future is here, and we keep talking about what we need to do over the next 5 years, what we want the future of EdTech to look like 15 to 20 years from today. But let's talk about assessing, measuring the impact of EdTech for it to inform what is to be done.
I see a future where young people don't need to sit in four walls to learn, where they can learn from their mobile phone or their VR headset.
I like that, right? Because then it's even more accessible, right? Especially as the unit economics actually come down with scale over time. A lot of opportunity there, a lot of opportunity in harmonizing at the non-tax and tax level optimizations that we can do. For example, in certain markets, you're taxed for the airtime or phone credit. You're taxed for the data you're going to buy to be able to access this service, and then you're heavily priced at the data point for you to be even able to consume. So from our perspective, harmonize what you can from a tax and non-tax perspective to create a fair playing ground for everyone to start to innovate. Then we build the market systems from there.
I see a future for EdTech in Africa where we build our own skills. So we have a lot of homegrown skills for EdTech, and we no longer import knowledge. So this talent gap is being heavily filled right now. So I'm giving another 2-3 years, we're going to be having our own homegrown instructional designers, our own homegrown UI UX designers, our own homegrown, whole field in EdTech. So you have people who understand the business and the science of education and can collaborate, come together to put all of that energy and expertise into building world-class products for Africa.
Our kids are innovators, right? So they're trying, they're touching, they're making things. So we're not going to be technologically dependent anymore. So in the future, we'll be innovators, and then we will be the owners of the technology itself.
Even now, there's a big debate in the education ecosystem about the role of AI in education, and I'm sure we're all having those discussions in our markets. And one of the biggest pieces is making sure that African developers, AI developers, are at the center of that conversation. African data is being used when responses are being generated by AI, and that we have an opinion. Our ecosystems are at the center of that conversation, making decisions about how and when and that AI gets built and used, and not just for AI, but for all of the technologies that are coming forward.
As somebody who's coming from the private sector, to me, I see the future of seeing multiple unicorn EdTech companies rising in the future. And it is possible. If today we are seeing the gap that is here, over 100 million students out of school today, this is a huge opportunity. And in the next few years to come, like in 2035, the Africa population will grow by 50%. So there is immense opportunity that is coming, and that's where there is opportunity for business.
Opportunity for business, you said. Let's have some contributions. I see Natalie has some contributions to make.
I think historically, the teacher has been the source of all the knowledge. And so through empowering the young people with digital skills to access that knowledge, then you're, in a sense, shifting the power and in the hands of the young person, which will lead into maybe some sort of reverse mentoring. This is no longer a teacher teaching you. It's, in some cases, the young person knowing more and then rethinking the role of a teacher in a classroom, maybe as a facilitator. So the overall impact is to really improve the education sector.
My contribution would be first of all to commend the efforts that have been done in EdTech Monday so far, but also to make a suggestion when it comes to standardizing the solutions that are being produced. Technology is only on the rise, and young people are getting access to these tools. But how are we making sure that these solutions are targeting specific needs in the community? At the end of the day, I can create a solution, you can create something, but are we specifically addressing something that is going to impact the community?
As we're thinking about the future, is to think that technology is not homogeneous. Technology does not look the same for every context. While we are talking about, for example, AI in very urban contexts, there's very many contexts in which that is not a conversation that's necessarily happening. And even if it's happening, it's still too far removed. So how do we still, as we innovate, carry everyone with us and design for inclusion and equity?
The critical point that I really want to echo is fundamentally when you implement the technological solutions, we're already seeing there's a digital gap, which means there's a segment of society that have a better access to technology, internet, and devices, and there's a society that doesn't have. And when we look at that, we really need to look at women, one, two, again, rural population. And some of the trend we've seen, especially, for example, in fintech, is where significantly there's around 80 to 20% usage, which are really leaning towards men, and women really are using these technology solutions. So when we look at what is the type of future we're looking at for EdTech as well, we have to make sure as we push for EdTech that we're not really increasing this digital gap, but actually reducing and really are intentional in terms of the approach and then the product that we're building. And overall, that all the solutions we're building are actually accessible not for only people that have a better access to device or better access to internet. While that's still good and while that increases the quality of education, but we have to make sure we're not living with people that have less access. And I think the bigger point and overall on that is, are we building an EdTech ecosystem that actually reduce the digital gap that we have seen and we can learn from other sectors that quite progressed. And I think that's quite important.
The future is here, and we keep talking about what we need to do over the next 5 years, what we want the future of EdTech to look like 15 to 20 years from today. But let's talk about assessing, measuring the impact of EdTech for it to inform what more needs to be done.
I think number one area to look at is to revise their policies, because we've been seeing policies that are not friendly to EdTech products. So once those policies are revised, once they have crafted a way to unlock the market where we can have more products tested out, the other thing is about creating sandboxes to EdTech solutions. It's something that has worked at least in fintech industry. It is possible to EdTech as well. So those elements will again bring to a component of collaboration where we bring all these multiple stakeholders together to discuss and shape the vision together and to work perfect.
I would say 3 words: research, funding, skills. We have a lot of universities in Africa, so can we begin to channel energy to support the professors, the doctors, and all of those people in academia to run extensive research on what we need and what we can do to support EdTech in our countries, right? And the government knowing that whatever is going to come out of this research is going to be adopted by them. Next, funding. Can we put in more money, more budgets, back in for education, budgetary allocations for education? And finally, skills. We need to build skills. We need to support people who are supporting people to build skills.
EdTech is a present, EdTech is a future. So we cannot exclude ourselves from EdTech. So it's not an option, it's a necessity. So we have to think like that. We have to have that mindset.
I would say evidence-based decision-making. So generating that evidence, using that evidence to collaboratively come up with how are we taking our work forward?
And really just building on that is pilot. The more you're in the market with actual teachers and learners, the more you're going to learn stuff that you can pivot and be able to scale up what works, scale down what doesn't. And then it's to then pick those learnings and put them in a market context so that these are sustainable solutions with or without government intervention. And the opportunity is vast. They can work.
And I would say scale up education inclusion using technology.
Suraj, the future.
Education models that are preparing our young people for dignified and fulfilling work for today and jobs of tomorrow. That needs to be our North Star. Why are we all in this room? What is it we're here for? We're not here to... yes, EdTech is a proponent to get us there, but that really should remain our North Star. And how do we do that? Where education systems are open to change, given the fast pace of work that's changing. And so policies need to be a lot more adaptable. But education needs to be very inclusive, not leaving anyone behind in terms of equity, in terms of gender, in terms of disabilities, in terms of displaced people. And creating these environments where learners, parents, teachers look forward to using education because it's fun, it's innovative, it gets learning and understanding deeper and better, rather than saying, because there are gaps, we're using technology. Let's flip it. And the last thing I'll say is, everyone, let's not look at technology as this behemoth that we have to adopt. It really is a tool to improve education.
It is a tool to improve education, and that's just where it is. And I think one of the other points that stuck with me is the fact that before our innovators even start to write any kind of code, there needs to be some consultation, collaboration, looking at what exactly the needs are. There can't be any meaningful innovations without consulting the people who use the tool as an implementing approach towards education. And so EdTech needs to have that sort of collaborative effort for us to make it a success. And so to our speakers for today, I want to say a big thank you. And I believe that with the thoughts that have been shared here from our EdTech Mondays partners, who are also key stakeholders in the EdTech ecosystem, I believe we have a goal on where exactly we need to go in terms of building and bolstering, as well as strengthening an EdTech ecosystem that works for us on the African continent, but at the end of it all, benefits the millions of learners as well as the teachers who are the implementers of these innovations. With that kind of conversation we just had with all our EdTech Mondays partners from 6 African countries, I'm sure you can tell that the solutions that came out of there, from funding to financial inclusion to developing with equity and inclusion in mind, and so much more, we can all agree that the future of Africa's EdTech ecosystem is in the right hands. My name is Joy Doreen Bira. Thank you all for joining us from Rwanda's capital, Kigali, here at Noshken Hub. And until the next edition, bye-bye for now.